complex trauma just takes this whole gradually learning about consequences and learning to live out of your cortex and learning to live in light of long-term consequences, and it messes that up. The first thing that happens in complex trauma is a child is in an environment that is dangerous. And so they have to be in their limbic brain. They have to be in survival mode. They have to do things to keep themselves safe now. And that is an instant gratification thing. I got to safety. So they're adapting all the time. They are learning to wear masks, to not be authentic, to keep secrets, to not open up to people, to not trust people, to manipulate people, to people please, to tell lies. All of those things, they're necessary for survival. Those are all their adaptations. And what happens is in the short term, they look to be very positive. They look to be the right move. They have immediate positive consequences. It keeps the child safe. It gets their needs met. It helps them to connect to a degree. It helps them to get some respect and to get some love. They seem to work. It's not till 20 or 30 years later that they start to experience the negative consequences of those adaptations. They start to realize that those were actually maladaptations. They are leading to more and more pain in their life. So complex trauma forces a child to have to adapt. Those adaptations give immediate positive consequences. And it's not till 20 or 30 years later that you begin to realize, wow, those are all negative. And it is doing nothing but bringing pain into my life. Now, it's so important to understand that the child that adapted at 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, they didn't tell lies, they didn't manipulate, they didn't keep secrets because they wanted to, because they thought it was a good idea, that that's the kind of person they wanted to be. No, they did it because that's all they knew how to do to survive. Those were the only tools available to them. They weren't saying, oh, I want to become this very unhealthy, bad person that nobody trusts and everybody turns against. They're going, no, I have to stay safe now. And so all of the adaptations aren't their fault. It's not they chose it because they had a full understanding of life and a full understanding of long term. They were thinking short-term survival. So, got to take that further. Initially, it's not their fault that they chose to lie. They chose to keep secrets. They chose to manipulate. It's not their fault. That's what they had to do to survive. But they reach a point in adult life where they begin to realize, hey, I'm in a safe environment now. I don't need to lie. I don't need to wear masks. I don't need to manipulate. If I continue to lie now, that's on me. If I continue to manipulate now, that's on me. I am now responsible to change my way of relating to people. From the old adaptations, which I now see are maladaptations, I now have to choose a different lifestyle. And if I don't, that is now on me. It is now my fault for the behavior that I'm choosing. So they were initially forced into that behavior. It wasn't really their choice, but now they are in a place where they can choose whether they continue that behavior or not. The second piece, and we've talked about, is the limbic brain is running the show in the child's life, but also in complex trauma. So the limbic brain is constantly in the driver's seat. It has to be in the driver's seat, not just because it's a child, because they need to survive, because there's danger everywhere. So the cortex doesn't develop properly. And the child doesn't transition from being governed by the limbic brain to a mature adult who's governed by the cortex. They get to adulthood still governed by the limbic brain. And as long as that is happening, they are still making decisions based on instant gratification. not based on long-term consequences, and so they are never going to make good decisions. They're always going to make decisions that give immediate positive consequences, but terrible long-term consequences. And so complex trauma sets a person up to still be governed more by their limbic brain. And so part of healing for people coming out of complex trauma is learning to recognize when your limbic brain is in power, then being able to get to your cortex brain so that your cortex brain is running the show. And that is a challenge because they've been in their limbic brain for so long. They've thought only of instant gratification, immediate consequences for so long that to transition to think of long-term consequences, to not give in to that instant gratification is very difficult. There's a third thing that comes out of complex trauma. Complex trauma trains your brain to behave a certain way. So you think of Pavlov's dog. Every time the bell rang, they knew there would be food. They began to salivate. You train animals today. You get them to do behavior, you reward them. You keep doing that, pretty soon you just give the command and they do the behavior. You can train somebody that if you do this, this will be the consequence. You do that long enough, pretty soon they'll do that and they just expect that that consequence will be there. So a good consequence trains them to do a certain behavior. But we also know that a bad consequence will train them to do a bad behavior or to stay in a bad behavior. So you look at fish that were able to swim through the whole tank. Then all of a sudden you put glass in the middle and they can't see it. But every time now they go to swim across the tank, they bump into the glass, they get hurt. They keep trying that until they begin to realize there's glass there. Every time I get to the middle of the tank, I get hurt. Now you take the glass away. The fish will swim up to the middle of the tank, but they'll never try to go beyond it because they're expecting glass there. You have trained them through painful consequences that they should never go there. And so you can train somebody through positive consequences, through negative consequences, to a certain type of behavior. So what happens in complex trauma? You can train a child through painful responses that this behavior is bad. You can train a child through positive rewards to do a certain behavior, and that could be a good behavior or could be a bad behavior. And complex trauma mistrains people by consequences, by rewarding stuff. So, for example, a child desires to be authentic. Something in them knows that that's a healthy thing to do. So they're authentic, but they keep getting punished for it. It's like the fish trying to swim across the tank. They keep bumping into this pain wall. So they begin to go, okay, never be authentic. It always results in pain. Or they get validated for the wrong thing. They get rewarded for the wrong thing. They get rewarded for their body. They get rewarded for only working hard, for only helping people. And so now they go, all my value comes from my body, from producing, from being productive. It doesn't come from who I am. They have been trained through the use of consequences to develop the wrong approach to life. Another one is a child naturally hopes. So now, every time in complex trauma, they get their hopes up that they're going to get love, their needs are going to get met. It doesn't happen. They get pain. So after a while, they go, stop hoping. Hope is a bad thing. It always results in getting hurt. And so training that turns out to be mistraining through the wrong use of pain, the wrong use of validation, can train a child in a very unhealthy lifestyle. And that's what happens in complex trauma. So what happens when those fish in the fish tank, you take the glass away and you go, it's all clear now. You can swim across the whole aquarium. Nope, not even going to try. I have been hurt too many times. And that's what happens to people with complex trauma. They come into recovery and you go, it's safe here now. You can be authentic. Nope, not going to try. Hey, we work by a different set of rules and a different set of consequences here. You can get hope again. Nope, not even going to try to get hope because I always get hurt. Let's just sabotage everything. And so complex trauma just messes that up. The next thing that comes out of this training is what's happening when you're training something is the brain is creating a brain circuit. So think of learning to throw a ball, learning to ride a bike. There's many different steps, parts to throwing a ball, pieces to the process. Same as riding a bike. And so when you first start to do it, you feel so uncoordinated. You can't get it right. It's just a disaster. You fall, you fail, because there's so many pieces to get coordinated together smoothly. So it requires intense practice, intense concentration. You have to do it over and over and over again until the brain gradually begins to piece together all of the different pieces and how to make them flow together. And it keeps working on it. And as it's doing it, it's developing a circuit in the brain that's getting this refined, that's getting this fine-tuned. And then once you've practiced it to such a point, you can start to do it without even thinking about it. The brain now goes from this being a conscious, focused activity to something you can do subconsciously. You can do it and you can be talking to others and you can ride a bike because you can do it subconsciously, autopilot. So what I want you to understand is this. Once that brain circuit has been produced and reinforced, the brain then puts an axon sheath around it to just protect it even more. Once you trigger the initial event, so you get on the bike, you put your left foot on the left pedal and get ready to mount the bike, all of a sudden that fires off the brain circuit. And then the rest just starts to flow. You put your foot you straddle the bike, put your foot on the other pedal, you get your balance, you start to pedal, it just flows. Once that brain circuit begins to fire, it's almost like gravitation takes over. It just wants to go through the whole process. And if you were to say, let's go 2 steps into the process that's part of this brain circuit and then stop it, the brain circuit go, no. We're going to go right through to the end of this brain circuit because you started not just a one action thing, you started a one action that tripped a tripwire that's got 50 actions that are now all going to flow. And so what then happens for people from complex trauma is this. When you had a certain type of danger or disrespect or not feeling heard or seen or being made to feel stupid, that triggered a brain circuit of how you would respond in actions, in your thinking, in your emotions. And you did that thousands of times. That became part of your subconscious. You just did it automatically. So now when somebody disrespects you today or you are made to feel stupid today, that trips that circuit. And it's like a gravitational pull that wants to pull you to all of those thoughts, all of those emotions, all of those actions. And to stop that is like trying to stop a train from leaving the station after it started. It is so challenging. And so the challenge with complex trauma is it creates brain circuits, and those brain circuits have consequences. And to stop that in process is very difficult. Now, there's another piece that adds to the challenge of this, and that's the chemical dopamine. So what happens when you're training a dog is you get it to do an action, and then you give it some food. That food is a reward, and that reward gives dopamine in the brain. That's what makes it feel like a reward. There's a pleasure there. But what's important to understand is that dopamine doesn't just create pleasure, it's now attached to a memory. And the whole point is this: the reward is related to memories that the brain thinks are necessary for survival. It thinks if I repeat that thing, then I'm going to stay alive, stay healthy. So it gives pleasure now to stuff necessary for survival. But what happens if the brain gets it wrong? Gets the wrong things necessary for survival as what it thinks is necessary for survival. So let's take a child from complex trauma who's gone through nothing but pain and emptiness, and all of a sudden they find drugs. All of a sudden they find food. And they go, that feels so good. That meets needs. That makes me feel good. Okay, let's get dopamine here because we think this is necessary for survival. So now you think of a crack addict, and now even before they use, which will give them dopamine, but even before they use and they think about going out to score, they start getting dopamine in their brain. They start getting a rush, and they haven't even used yet. Why? Because the brain is saying, yes, follow through on this because this is necessary for survival. It's already rewarding them before they've actually partaken in using the drugs. So dopamine now, if it creates mistrained systems in the brain that say, when you think about this, I'm going to give you rewards already because this is necessary for survival. And so I'm going to start giving you good consequences right now and instant gratification, when that could lead to terrible consequences long term. So dopamine systems can be mistrained is the point, and can give wonderful instant gratification but terrible long-term consequences. So let's take it a bit farther. Many children from complex trauma had inconsistent consequences. So some days dad got mad at them when they did something, other days dad did nothing, other days dad praised them. Some days they had, for a good action, some days positive responses, some days negative responses. For a bad action, some days they got punished for it, some days they got away with it. Inconsistent, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And so what can happen with inconsistent consequences is you're not sure what to believe. Is this an actual consequence that's going to consistently happen every time? Because if it does, then I either stop doing it or I keep doing it. But what happens if sometimes I get rewarded for a bad consequence? Sometimes I don't get rewarded. Sometimes I don't get rewarded for a good consequence. Sometimes I actually get paid for a good consequence, for a good behavior. So it's all confusing. So what do I do? And that's complex trauma. And so what we have found with addiction issues is addictions that give inconsistent consequences are some of the hardest addictions to break. So take, for example, gambling. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. What does that always do in the brain? Well, maybe I'll win this time. Maybe it'll be worth it this time. Or I've had a series of bad luck. Maybe it's about time I'm going to get good luck. It creates a false hope. Because always growing up in complex trauma, there would always be a positive consequence at some point if I just kept trying long enough. And so complex trauma for many people was all about inconsistent consequences. And that can really mess up as you move forward in thinking about consequences. There's another aspect of complex trauma, and that's unfair consequences, injustice. So what about the child who constantly tried to do the right thing and always got punished for it? They kept trying to be authentic. They kept trying to be honest. They kept trying to be open and vulnerable and totally human, and they kept getting punished for it. Or they did something bad and the punishment didn't suit the crime. It was over the top. It was unfair. It was too harsh. What happens in a child where the consequences are not fair. After a while, you just shut down. You just harden your heart. You go, who cares? Life isn't fair. I'm just going to do whatever I want. Short-term pleasure is better than nothing because I'm going to get pain. It's not going to be fair. I'm just going to take this little bit of pleasure I can get, and who cares about anything else? It really shapes the thinking in a very destructive way. But that comes out of complex trauma. Then there's another piece that comes out of complex trauma for some, and that is the spoiled child. Parents who never let the child experience negative consequences, who never imposed negative consequences. Parents who took negative consequences away. They paid off the police. They talked people out of tickets. They talked to teachers and threatened to stop supporting the school if they didn't pass the child. All kinds of things parents did so the child would not have to experience pain, and the parents thought it was being loving. But what was happening to the child? The child was thinking, I can do whatever I want, and there's either nothing bad ever going to happen, so there's no such thing as consequences, or I can wiggle out of every situation. So yeah, some bad stuff might start to happen, but I'm pretty sure I can find a way to wiggle out, to get somebody to get me out of it. So a child coming out of being spoiled, consequences doesn't carry the weight it should in their decision-making processes. They just, again, get preoccupied with instant gratification and don't even think long-term consequences should be factored in. There's one other piece here to complex trauma, and we've already talked about it. I just want to develop it a bit farther, and it's this. The adaptations they have to have gave instant, immediate, positive consequences. They didn't experience the negative consequences long-term until 20 to 30 years later. There was that 20 to 30 year delay. Now, the key that I want to focus on is this. It wasn't like 20 or 30 years later, on one day, all of the negative consequences showed up full-blown, full impact, and hit them between the eyes. No, it's not how it works. It's like they're going 20, 30 years later, and all of a sudden they start to notice, oh, there's a negative consequence here happening when I tell a lie, when I'm not respectful, when I manipulate people. But there's still positive consequences. So their consequences show up gradually, the negative, but they're still being offset by all the positive consequences that are still coming out of lying and manipulating. So I think an illustration that might help you understand this is like, think of a great big swimming pool of crystal clear water, and at 5-year-old, you take a little eyedropper of ink and you squirt it into the pool. It looks like there's zero consequence. Pool is still crystal clear. The next day you put a little dropper of ink in the pool, and it goes on and on and on, and you don't begin to experience the negative consequences of the eyedropper of ink until years later. When you start to go, the pool's a bit, I don't like the color of the pool, but yeah, it's still safe. There's still a lot of positive. So that delayed experience of the consequences that show up very gradually, and the positives still outweigh the negatives for many years. That's the reality of complex trauma and the experience of long-term consequences. But then we have some tendencies when that starts to happen. Our brain tends to focus on accenting the positive benefits that we're still getting and minimizing, denying, or rationalizing the negative. So we choose to see life in a skewed way, where we overemphasize, yeah, but look how positive it is, and underemphasize the negative. We don't see life accurately. Then the next tendency is, once life starts delivering negative consequences, our first response is to blame others, not to see it as the consequence of choices we've made. So that's another way of avoiding looking at life accurately. Then the next thing we do is we minimize the severity of the negative consequence. Well, it's not that bad. So we're still not seeing life accurately. And then for some people out of complex trauma, they've been in a fantasy world for so long that they can escape into fantasy that there'll be no negative consequences, that it'll be all positive. And that's their way of denying reality. So what I want you to see is what comes out of complex trauma is this slow experience of consequences. Positives still outweigh the negatives. They show up very gradually. We have all of these tendencies within us to not look at life accurately. And so that's why change, facing consequences, listening to consequences, and actually changing our behavior doesn't happen overnight. And so the stages of change model came into existence because of all of this. And basically it says we start in denial, pre-contemplation, go, no, it's not a big deal. Don't have a problem here. Then we go to contemplation where we go, I'm getting a few negative consequences, but the positives are still outweighing the negatives. So I'm ambivalent. I think I'm going to need to change, but I still got so many positives. I'm sitting on the fence. I really don't think I want to change yet. I wonder if there's a way I can minimize the negative consequences I'm experiencing and maximize the positives that I'm experiencing. And that's where the brain spends most of its time. But then the negative consequences begin to pile up. Soon they're starting to outweigh the positive consequences. We're getting more pain than positive. And so then we get to the preparation stage and we go, I think I need to change. But do you realize that could take years before we get from pre-contemplation to preparation? That we can be in contemplation stage, sitting on the fence, with the positives outweighing the negatives in our mind for years before we actually get to the preparation stage where we go, I think I need to change. What's that going to involve? But then we can be in the preparation stage for years because we go, am I willing to count the cost? Am I willing to put the work in? Am I willing to make these changes? I'm willing to do this stuff? I don't know if I am. Maybe it'd be easier to go back. Maybe I'm missing something where I can still get positives and minimize the negatives. Before we get to the action stage, before we actually face honestly the long-term consequences and look at life accurately, we can spend years in the stages of change. And that's the reality of what comes out of complex trauma, is we don't look at consequences properly. It takes us a long time to get to the point where we actually do. Once we do, we can begin to grow.